Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is Duel, Terror Stories by Richard Matheson. Now, this is a collection of short stories, obviously written by Richard Matheson. Now, this actual collection was published in 2003, however, all the stories in here were published decades earlier in different literary magazines. And this collection also begins with a little appreciation from Ray Bradbury, which I thought was really interesting because Ray Bradbury was a huge influence on Richard Matheson. In a lot of ways, Matheson owes a lot to Ray Bradbury, and in this little letter of appreciation, Bradbury is so complimentary to him. He says, "Richard Matheson is worth our time, attention, and great affection," and I couldn't agree more with that. And of course, both men are unfortunately no longer with us, and it's kind of interesting that both of them died almost a year apart from each other. Bradbury died in 2012, and Matheson died in 2013. Now, Richard Matheson was the author of books like I Am Legend and What Dreams May Come, both of which are two of my top 5 favorite books of all time. He also wrote books like Hell House and The Shrinking Man and A Stir of Echoes. He was also a huge influence on Stephen King. Stephen King has said that the person who influenced him the most as a writer was Richard Matheson. Matheson was also a huge part of The Twilight Zone. Some of the most famous and iconic episodes of that show were either written by or based on short stories by Richard Matheson. In fact, I would almost argue that he was just as integral to that show as Rod Serling was. Like, yes, Rod Serling was the creator of that show, and he also wrote some great episodes of that show, but Matheson's contribution to that series cannot be underestimated. Now, while Matheson was a great novelist, I also think he was very underrated as a short story writer, and I think some of the best examples of his short stories are in this book, and I also highly recommend his collection Nightmare at 20,000 Feet. Now, in this video, I'm going to be reviewing each individual story from this collection, so needless to say, this is going to be a pretty long video. So, the first story featured in this collection is, of course, the title story, Duel. Now, Duel was originally published in Playboy magazine in 1971, and this was adapted into the film of the same name by Steven Spielberg. Now, I'll talk more about the film adaptation after my review of this short story. Now, the plot of Duel is it's about this salesman driving to San Francisco, and he's being followed by this psychopath in a truck. Like, he tries to pass the truck, and then the truck passes him and won't let him pass, and then when he does pass this truck, the truck just starts following him, and soon it becomes apparent that the guy driving this truck clearly intends to kill him. Matheson actually got the idea for this story when him and a friend of his were about to go golfing, and this was actually on the day that Kennedy was assassinated, and they were so distressed by what they heard that they just decided to go home, and as they were driving home, they were being tailgated by this huge truck, and this was sort of the genesis for this story. Now, while I do think this is a very good story, and I appreciate that it's one of Matheson's most famous stories, honestly, it's not one of my personal favorite Matheson stories. Now, the story is 30 pages long, but to be honest though, I think it's overlong. I think it could be 10 pages shorter, to be honest. And don't get me wrong, I still think it's a good story, but honestly though, I think it works better as a movie because the whole story is literally just this guy being followed around by this truck, which is a scary premise, but at the same time though, I think that premise works better in a visual medium as opposed to reading it. For some reason, while reading it, it just comes off as being sort of slower, where once again, I think it works so much better as a movie. Now, as I pointed out already, this story was adapted into a film of the same name directed by Steven Spielberg, which actually came out the same year that the story was published, 1971. Now, a lot of people mistake that for being Spielberg's first movie, which it wasn't. I think it was his second movie, but to be fair, I think I've made that mistake before because I've spoken about the movie before, and I think I have mistakenly called it Spielberg's first movie, but it was one of his first movies, and apparently every couple of years he does rewatch that movie to remind himself of what he once was. But the movie Duel is awesome, and it's a made-for-TV movie, but it doesn't feel like a made-for-TV movie, and it actually later on got a theatrical release. But yeah, I highly recommend the movie Duel. Honestly, I recommend it more than the original story. Now, a few years after this story was published, Dean Koontz wrote a similar story called Shattered, which was sort of a similar premise. It was about this psychotic truck driver stalking this guy and his brother-in-law across country. The only difference was, in that story, you actually got to know who this truck driver was, whereas in this short story, you have no idea who this truck driver actually is. Now, both this story and the Steven Spielberg film had a huge influence on the movie Joyride and its sequels. Now, Stephen King and his son Joe Hill did a short story called Throttle, which was a tribute to this story, and both this story and Throttle were adapted into a comic book called Road Rage. Now, the next story featured in this collection is called Third from the Sun, and this was originally published in Galaxy in 1950. Now, the plot of Third from the Sun is it's about this man who's the test pilot for this ship capable of intergalactic travel, and this man firmly believes that nuclear war is inevitable, and within a few years, maybe less, the world will destroy itself via nuclear war. So, him and his family and his neighbor's family now plan to basically hijack this ship and use it to escape from the planet before this nuclear war happens. And there is a twist at the end of this, which I won't give away, but it's pretty interesting. But this was an excellent story, and you could tell it was written in the 50s because of all the themes of nuclear warfare. This was right at the beginning of the whole Cold War era, so you could tell it's a story of the 1950s. At the same time, though, a lot of the fears and anxieties that this story is bringing up are still relevant today. So, in a lot of ways, this story could have almost have been written today. And you feel really bad for the main characters of this story because they have to leave their life behind them, and there's something very sad and melancholy about this story. Now, this story was adapted into an episode of The Twilight Zone, which is actually one of my favorite Twilight Zone episodes, and I actually think is one of the more underrated episodes. The next story in here is called When the Waker Sleeps, and this was originally published in the December issue of Galaxy magazine in 1950, and this was originally published under the title The Waker Dreams. Now, the plot of this story is it's set thousands of years in the future, and it appears that Earth is being invaded by these alien creatures, and it follows this one character who's the captain in one of Earth's armies, who's trying to hold back the alien forces, but there is a reveal in this story that reveals that everything you were reading about up until that point was not what it seemed to be, and when you get that reveal, it goes from being this kind of generic alien invasion story, and it actually becomes this really thought-provoking story with a lot of really potent social commentary about what technology is doing to us as a species. And the story is really about how our over-reliance on technology is kind of contributing to the de-evolution of the human race. And what's really amazing to me about this story is this was published in 1950, yet a lot of the social commentary in here is still very much relevant today. In fact, it might even be more relevant today with stuff like the internet and how, like, attached we are becoming to our technology. But it's a great story. I highly recommend it. The next story in here is called Born of Man and Woman, and this was originally published in the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1950, and this was actually Matheson's first story. Now, this story is all told from the point of view of a little kid who is chained up in the basement of his house by his mother and father, and he's constantly beaten by his mother and father whenever he tries to escape, and since he's been kept in this basement all his life, he doesn't really understand how the real world works, so when he looks outside and he sees that it's raining, he says things like, "Water's coming down from the upstairs." And then when he sees, like, a little boy or a little girl walking outside, he identifies that little boy or little girl as a little mother or a little father. And eventually you find out that there is something abnormal about this kid. It doesn't excuse the abuse that his parents put him through, but you almost get the idea that because of what's wrong with this kid, it's like that's the only way the parents know how to deal with it. But this is an excellent and very disturbing story, and this is another story that, even though this was published in the early 1950s, it really does feel ahead of its time. Like, this almost could have been published today and it would have had the same impact, I think. It's also interesting that since this is all told from the point of view of a child, it's intentionally poorly written, as if it's a child writing this, and it's actually very similar to another Richard Matheson story called Dress of White Silk, which was also written in the same way, and that was also all told from the point of view of a child. The next story in here is called Return, and this was originally published in Thrillin' Wonder Stories in 1951, and this is actually one of my favorite stories in this entire collection. The story is about this college professor who, along with his colleagues, has actually invented a time machine, and he's about to travel 500 years into the future, and his wife is really worried about this. Like, she's afraid that he won't come back, but he promises that he'll return to her no matter what. But when he gets to the future, he discovers to his horror that the people he meets there won't let him go. But that's all I want to say about this story, but this is a deeply heartbreaking story. And it's really a tragic love story because it's really about the love that this man has for his wife, and I don't want to give it away, but it does not end well for the main character. And it's also sort of a ghost story in a way, but kind of a sci-fi time travel take on the ghost story. But Return is an excellent story, and it will definitely make you cry. It's a very sad story. The next story in here is called Brother to the Machine, and this was originally published in Worlds of If in 1952. Now, this story is set in an unspecified time in the future where humans and robots coexist with each other, and it's very much implied that Earth is warring with other planets. Like, at one point the main character comes across a newspaper article that talks about why it was necessary to wipe out all the Martians. At one point, he comes across the pet store and sees these little tentacled creatures in a cage, and on the cage it says, "Buy a Venus baby for your child." But the story follows this character who is running away from some people, but really the story is sort of a day in the life kind of story. It's a day in the life of this futuristic world. But this was an excellent story, and there's a lot of commentary on like class systems and technology and the military. It's a very good story. I definitely recommend it, and it actually reminded me a lot of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, which is the book that inspired the movie Blade Runner. But this was written before Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, but it feels very Philip K. Dickish. The next story in here is called F, and this was originally published under the title The Foodlegger in Thrillin' Wonder Stories in 1952. What's really interesting about this story is this is sort of a more lighthearted version of Return. In fact, you could almost look at this as sort of a companion piece or even a semi-sequel to Return, because the main character of this story has the same name as the main character of that story. In some ways, you could say that maybe they're the same character, even though this story is obviously not in continuity with Return. I almost look at the main character of this story as being sort of an alternate universe version of the character from Return. But the story follows a time traveler from 1954 named Robert Wade, who travels into an unspecified time in the future, and in case of emergency, he brought a little food with him. But when he lands in this certain time period and the people see that he has food, you would think this guy was a child molester, the way these people are treating him, and he's actually arrested simply for having food. It turns out that because of biological warfare, most animal species have gone extinct, and plant life can't grow anymore, so food is virtually non-existent in this future, so mankind has developed a way to basically get their nutrients via injections. But not only is food virtually non-existent, whatever food is left is illegal, and even saying the word food is considered to be obscene. And simply consuming food in this future is almost like an act of sexual deviancy. But it's actually a really funny story. It's pretty much a satire or a farce, and for this collection, it's a nice change of pace because a lot of the stories leading up to this were just downright depressing. And don't get me wrong, I liked the depressing stories, but for this collection, once again, it's a nice change of pace, especially reading it after something like Return, which was really depressing. The next story in here is called Lover When You're Near Me, and this was originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction in 1952. This story is about a man who has to spend 6 months on an alien planet, and his housemaid is this female alien, and when he first meets her, he calls her Lover, but he doesn't really know why he called her Lover, and this creature can communicate with him via telepathy, and it starts talking to him even when he's miles away from the house, and it starts getting to him because it's clear that this creature loves him, and soon it becomes apparent that this creature intends to rape him. Now, I don't think Matheson ever actually uses the word rape, but that's very much what's implied because, once again, this thing does love him like a lover. But this is a good story, and sort of like F, it is kind of a black comedy. And there's a lot of commentary in here about masculinity and male vulnerability. The next story in here is called Shipshape Home, and this was originally published in the July issue of Galaxy Science Fiction in 1952. Now, the plot of this story is it's about a writer who lives in an apartment building with his wife Ruth, and Ruth becomes very suspicious of the building's janitor. But you come to learn that it's not uncommon for Ruth to be paranoid, but as the story goes on, it becomes apparent that Ruth's paranoia is correct. Now, to be honest, this is actually my least favorite story in the collection. I mean, it's alright, but it really doesn't do anything for me, mainly because I actually found the character of Ruth to be pretty annoying, which I feel bad saying because it's clear that Richard Matheson based this character off of his actual wife, whose name was Ruth. I just hope the actual Ruth Matheson wasn't like the character from this story, because, once again, I found the character of Ruth from this story to be pretty insufferable, honestly. And while, yes, you do find out at the end of the story that she was technically right to be paranoid, because she suspected random people in the past of wrongdoing, it kind of made me really dislike this character. And I feel bad saying that because it's clear Matheson wrote this to be sort of a cute little story about the relationship between him and his wife, because the male character in the story who's a writer is clearly based on Richard Matheson himself. And the story is mostly a comedy. But this story wasn't my cup of tea. If you like it, that's cool. The one thing I will say is maybe the paranoia that Ruth has in this story, you could say that maybe Matheson was trying to reflect the actual paranoia going on in America at the time, like the whole fear of espionage, because this was right at the beginning of the Cold War. Now, this story was adapted into a 1955 episode of Studio 57 called Young Couples Only. That episode actually had Peter Lorre in it, which I think is interesting because there are actually a lot of Peter Lorre references in this story. The next story in here is called SLR Ad, and this was originally published in the magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 1952. Now, this story is about a college student who sees this personal ad in the paper from somebody claiming to be a girl from Venus. Now, he thinks this is a joke, and he responds to it, but then this Venus gal responds back and thinks he's serious, and it turns out that she's actually a girl from Venus. And when he realizes that this is no joke, he starts getting freaked out, and it's a really funny story. And the whole story is told as letters sent back and forth between different characters, but it's an absolutely hilarious story, or at least I thought it was really funny. And this one could be looked at as sort of a companion piece to Lover When You're Near Me. The next story in here is Death Ship. Now, this was originally published in Fantastic Story magazine in 1953. Now, this is an absolutely horrifying story. Like, it is a science fiction story, but it's also just as much a horror story as it is science fiction. Now, the plot of Death Ship is it's about these men who land on this planet. Basically, their job is to scout out possibly inhabitable planets because the world is getting overpopulated and they're supposed to find a planet that humans can migrate to. But while on this one planet, they see a crashed spaceship, and one of the men at first thinks this might be an alien spaceship because they don't see any reason why another Earth ship should be on this planet. But when they investigate this, they discover to their horror that this is a ship from Earth, and not only that, it's their ship. And then they find their bodies. And that's all I want to say about this story, but once again, this is an absolutely horrifying and creepy as fuck story. And this is very much a ghost story. This is basically a ghost story set in space. And what you see in this story is basically a futuristic outer space version of the concept of the ghost ship. But once again, I highly recommend Death Ship. I think it's one of the best stories in here, and it's one of Matheson's best stories, period. Now, this was adapted into a Twilight Zone episode of the same name, which is definitely one of my favorite episodes of that show. The next story featured in this collection is The Last Day, and this was originally published in Amazing Stories in 1953. Now, this story, I don't even know if my review is going to do this story a justice, because this is probably my favorite Richard Matheson short story. Like, my favorite Matheson novel is I Am Legend, but in terms of his short fiction, I think this is his best short story. Granted, I haven't read all of his short stories, but of what I've read, I think this is his best story, at least short story-wise. Like, this is such a powerful and haunting and depressing, but strangely beautiful story as well. And this story will definitely have you crying. If you have a soul, this story is gonna have you crying. But the plot of the story is, it's the last day on Earth. Basically, there's this solar event that's about to happen that's going to wipe out all life on Earth, and it follows this man named Richard who, on the last day on Earth, decides to reconnect with his mother, who he has sort of an estranged relationship with. Now, this story should be really bleak and nihilistic because it's dealing with the end of the world and the last day on Earth, but it is bleak. But I can't say it's nihilistic, though, because, believe it or not, the ending of this story does give you a strange sense of hope. Because the main character's mother is a deeply religious woman, and she's not afraid. She's just like, hey, God's closing the curtain on our play, but we're all gonna see each other again in heaven. And that's kind of what the story's saying almost, is like, even in the bleakest of situations, we gotta have some hope. And what the story's almost saying is like, even if the world does end, who knows, maybe there is a God, and if there is a God, that means that as long as we were here, we had a purpose. And who knows, maybe life will continue on some other plane of existence, but the thing is, you don't know, and that is the most horrifying thing about the story, but really that's the most horrifying thing about death in general, is we don't know what's on the other side, if anything. But the ending is strangely uplifting, even though it should be really nihilistic, but it's so moving as well. And there's one scene in particular that really fucked me up. There's a scene in this story where Richard's sister and his brother-in-law and his niece commit suicide, but the niece is only a little girl, so she doesn't understand what's going on, and they kill themselves with sleeping pills after they have their last dinner together, and the mother's telling the little girl that it's candy that they're having for dessert, and that just, like, I was actually on the brink of sobbing when I was reading that, especially the part where it talks about how his niece, like, rests her head on her father's shoulders, and I was like, I was crying. And one thing that's really impressive to me about this story is this was published in 1953, yet there's really nothing in the story that dates it. This feels like it could have been written today. Once again, I cannot recommend this story enough, but it is hard to read, though. It is just very depressing and very bleak, but also very moving. The next story in here is Little Girl Lost, and this was originally published in, I think, the October issue of Amazing Stories in 1953. Now, this is about a mother and father who hear their little girl calling out to them, but they can't see her. Long story short, it turns out that their child has somehow gotten sucked into another dimension, and now they're desperately trying to get her back before she's lost forever. But this is a great story, and it is a fantastic story. Like, there's no way in hell something like this would actually happen, but what if it did? And I could not imagine the horror that these parents must be going through, like, thinking, like, what if I lose my child? And yes, it's nothing that can happen in real life, but still, what Matheson did really well with his stories was he took normal people and put them in these fantastic situations. Now, this was adapted into a Twilight Zone episode of the same name, which is another one of my favorite episodes of that show. I could also see the whole idea of a child being trapped in another dimension and the parents desperately trying to get that child back as being sort of an inspiration for Poltergeist, where you had Carol Ann stuck in the ghost dimension and her parents were trying to get her back. I could also see it being sort of an inspiration for Stranger Things, where you had Will stuck in the Upside Down and his mother was trying to get him back. The next story in here is called Trespass, and this was originally published under the title Mother by Protest in Fantastic in 1953. Now, this is about a man who comes back home after being away for 6 months on a science expedition because the main character is a scientist, and when he comes home, he discovers that his wife is pregnant, but there's no way that he could possibly be the father, but she claims that she had no extramarital affairs. Now, he of course doesn't believe her, even though he wants to believe her because he doesn't want to believe that his wife was unfaithful to him. Now, this was a very interesting story. I will say the whole twist when you find out what's causing this woman's pregnancy, I kinda saw it coming, but it's still a really good story, mainly because it's really a drama about the breakdown of this marriage. It just happens to have sort of a sci-fi twist to it. My only issue with this story is you could tell it was written in the 50s, mainly in how the main female character is written, and also you have a bunch of men talking about what to do about this woman's pregnancy, and it never really seems like she has much of a say in it. Now, granted, when they find out what's actually going on, I do kind of understand why the main character doesn't want to tell his wife what's actually going on with her pregnancy. At the same time, though, there was something like, granted, I know I'm looking at this from a 21st century perspective. I understand this was written in the 50s, which was a different time, but it's a little troublesome that you have a story about a woman's pregnancy, but it's mostly told from the point of view of a bunch of men. I know it seems like I'm offended by it, I'm really just pointing it out. It's just one thing that I didn't particularly like about the story, but other than that, I still really enjoyed this story. Now, this was adapted into a made-for-TV movie called The Stranger Within in 1974. The next story in here is Bean. Now, this was originally published in Worlds of If in 1954. Now, this is about a married couple who are traveling from California to New York to see the wife's family, and they stop at a gas station for gas and water, but it turns out that the station doesn't have everything they need, so the gas station attendant tells them to come over to his house, and he'll give them what they need, and he also tells them to go check out a zoo he has set up in his backyard. They reluctantly follow him to his house, but when they see his zoo, they see people in the cages. He ends up locking this husband and wife in a cage, and it turns out that this guy is actually sacrificing people to something from beyond our world. This is a really good story, and there's actually a surprising amount of character development with the main villain. Like, the main villain is actually a very three-dimensional character, and is actually kind of sympathetic because you realize it's not entirely his fault. And this is another story from this collection that was written in the 50s, but it feels very ahead of its time, because this doesn't feel like a story from the 50s. Honestly, if I didn't know this was published in 1954, I would have said this was 70s, because I got a real, almost Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibe from this story. Like, it almost felt like a sci-fi version of Texas Chainsaw, but this was published 20 years before Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And this really does feel like a cross between the alien genre and the slasher genre, even though this was published years and years before slasher films were even a thing. And the monster in this story actually reminded me a lot of the Blob. Like, it was almost like the Blob if the Blob had intelligence. The next story in here is The Test, and this was originally published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in 1954. Now, this story is set in the future. It's actually set in the year 2003, because once again, this was published in the 50s, and obviously back then, 2003 was the future. But basically, in this future, to control the population, senior citizens every couple of years have to take this test to see if they're adequate enough to live. And the story follows this old man in his 80s who is studying for the test, and it becomes apparent to his son and the rest of his family that there's no way he's going to pass the test. And the story also focuses a lot on his son and his son's sadness over the fact that his father in all likelihood is going to fail this test and then be executed, but also his shame over the fact that there's a part of him that kind of wants his father to fail this test because taking care of his father has become so burdensome on his family. But also shame over the fact that it was his generation who made this test a law. Now, this is an excellent story, but it is a really sad story, and this story actually hit me pretty hard because my grandfather died this year, so reading this story really did bring up a lot of thoughts about that. But if you can handle depressing stories, I definitely recommend it. I also recommend it if you're a fan of dystopian stories. The next story in here is one for the books, and this was originally published in Galaxy Science Fiction in 1955. Now, this story is about a janitor at a college who wakes up one morning and finds that he can speak French. And he has no idea how he can speak French, and it turns out that every department he cleans for, he ends up gaining the knowledge of that department, like all the knowledge that's contained in the books in that department and stuff. Like, at one point he could solve really complex mathematical equations. There's one point in the story where he walks into a library and he feels like his head is going to explode because he's being overloaded with the knowledge contained in this library. And while most people might find something like this to be really cool, he hates it because he has no idea how and why this is happening to him, and it's really starting to freak him out, and also people in his life are starting to kind of turn on him. Like, a friend of his who is a pathological liar, at one point he's talking to his friend, and then he starts telling his friend why pathological liars are the way they are, and his friend just punches him in the face. And eventually in the story, he starts getting exploited by the faculty at this college. But this is a really good story. It's nothing spectacular. It's nothing where I'm like, holy shit, you have to read this. It's not like The Last Day, but it's a good, adequate story. I did find the scene where he's talking to his pathological liar friend in the bar to be pretty interesting, because at one point his friend's talking about this senator or somebody running for office who he thinks is a commie, and he's saying you shouldn't vote for him, and then the main character says, well, you voted for him, because he knows these things, and this guy doesn't want to admit that he voted for him and stuff, and I thought it was really interesting, like, when he starts telling this guy about the senator he's talking about, he doesn't want to hear it, because he's so dead set in his views that he doesn't want anything that contradicts his views, even if those are facts. Now, this was adapted into an episode of the TV series Amazing Stories. Now, I've never seen that episode, so I can't really comment on how true or untrue that episode is to this story. And the final story featured in this collection is Steel. Now, Steel was originally published in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction in 1956. Now, this story is set in a future where boxing has become outlawed and human boxers have been replaced with cyborgs. And the story follows a former boxer named Tim Kelly, who used to be known as Steel, but ever since humans got replaced with cyborgs in boxing, he became the owner of a boxing cyborg, but this cyborg that he owns is now old and falling apart, and they're about to go to a fight, and his mechanic keeps telling him this thing doesn't stand a chance, and that's really all I want to say about the story. I don't want to give away what Steel ends up doing. Now, this is a really good story, and it's obviously making a commentary on machines replacing us. Like, it's very much a commentary on technology, and this idea of technology supplanting human life. Well, maybe not human life, but definitely human activities in this story. But this is also very much a story about recapturing the glory days. But this is a really good story, and if you get your hands on this collection, I definitely recommend giving this story a read. However, the story is available in other Richard Matheson collections. Now, this story was the basis for the Twilight Zone episode of the same name, which I've actually never seen, and I watch the Twilight Zone marathon that Sci-Fi Channel does every New Year's, but for some reason I've never seen that episode. I don't know if maybe I somehow miss it, or maybe they just don't play it. But since I've never seen that episode, I can't really speak on it too much. This story was also the basis for the 2011 film Real Steel with Hugh Jackman. Now, I remember when that movie came out, but I really had no interest in seeing it, and I knew it was based on this story, but I really had no interest because it was so clear that that movie was not going to follow the story at all, and I get why it didn't, because this is just a short story, and that was a full-length movie, but from what I can tell based on the previews, it seems like that movie completely missed the point of the original short story. So, that was my review on Duel, Terror Stories by Richard Matheson. Once again, I cannot recommend the stories in this collection enough. I mean, yes, some were better than others, like, the only one here that I didn't really like was Shipshape Home. The other ones I highly recommend. Even Duel, even though I think Duel works better as a movie, even that I would recommend. Now, Duel does kind of feel like the odd man out, because besides Duel, all the other stories in here are science fiction. Even Born of Man and Woman, you could kind of count as a science fiction story. But oddly enough, Duel still kind of fits, because a common theme that you'll see throughout all the stories in this collection is there's sort of this theme of technology turning against us, or technology replacing us, or taking us over, and even though Duel's not a science fiction story, it's still very much a story about man versus machine, and I feel like that's the major theme of most of the stories in this collection. But then you have stories that don't fit that theme at all, like Little Girl Lost and The Last Day and Born of Man and Woman and such. But this collection is really near and dear to my heart. I first got this in high school, and I read most of these stories years ago, ago. Obviously, I reread them in preparation for this review, and some of the stories in here I did actually read for the first time before doing this review, but it was the stories from this collection and the stories from this book, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, that really made me fall in love with Richard Matheson as a short story writer. I already loved his novels like I Am Legend and What Dreams May Come, but he was also very underrated as a teller of short stories. Now, both these collections are more modern collections, and all the stories in both these collections were published decades prior, so a lot of the stories that you'll find in both Nightmare at 20,000 Feet and Duel are also available in other Richard Matheson collections. So even if you don't get this collection, if you find another collection from him, you might find some of the same stories that are in this book. Now, real quick before I end this video, I just want to give my top 5 favorite stories from this collection. Number 5 would definitely be Little Girl Lost. Number 4 would be Death Ship. Number 3 would be The Test. Number 2 would be Return, and my number 1 favorite story from this collection is The Last Day. I don't know what that says about me, that my top 3 favorite stories from here are probably 3 of the most depressing stories you'll ever read in your life, but whatever, that's the kind of fella I am. And if I had to give an honorable mention, I would probably say Brother to the Machine. And once again, I gotta quote Ray Bradbury: Richard Matheson is worth our time, attention, and great affection.